Okay, so now I've just got used to this new way of doing, or we've all just got to new ways of doing things. Looks like we're getting back onto track to doing them normally. So, if there is, first of all, if there is an official notification about Blackboard in the next 24 hours or so, then I will send an email round to all of your personal addresses, and I'll also send a message via Blackboard so that we can all get back to doing things normally. And if it is that it's back normal, then I shall, I think, return to Blackboard for the live seminar on Friday. But let's just not hold our breath, say, for this just for the moment. So, live seminars this week. So today I'm going to go into more detail into what IPA is and the process through IPA, and also some examples of analysis of IPA data. But after today's session, what I'm going to do on Friday is I'm actually going to spend time going through the transcript, or some of, not all the transcript, some of the transcript for the assignment. So that what I'd really like is that, I will go through it and provide some ideas of my own. But if you've already looked at it, it would be really good if you're in a position to and happy to join in with the discussion of things that you might also pull out. As I say, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but I think it might be useful, particularly for people who are not at all familiar with working with qualitative data, just to see the sorts of things that I'm looking at, that I'm pulling out, and that sort of thing, and then trying to generate some themes and that sort of thing. So hopefully it will be useful. So Friday I will focus very much on the assignment, and I'll also talk about a little bit about how you might construct your assignment, what it might look like in terms of a finished piece as well. So that should be helpful as well. And then when that's done on Friday, of course, when I've done that, then we've only got 1 week left. So then I'm not quite sure what we'll do next week. We'll just see. We'll see where we are. We'll see how everything's working. But there's stuff around things like mixed methods and things like that I can cover, and all sorts of other things. So just to quadruple confirm, Hayden, yes, the submission dates are the 27th of September. That's what I said the other day. I don't see any reason to change that. Of course, if you've got them done before then and Blackboard's up and running, then you can get them submitted. That will be fine. Okay. So back to today, and just talking about IPA in some more detail, sort of almost from start to finish, really, of an IPA study. Apart from having a name that's really hard to pronounce, interpretative phenomenological analysis. Basically, it pulls together the idea of two different areas. One, of course, the phenomenology, which is the existence that we live and our lived experience of life. And I mean, this is something that in the early days of psychology was very much a focus of psychology, was about the interpretation of our lives, our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions from a lived experience perspective. And it got cast aside for the more experimental behavioural approaches of looking at the way that people behave and the things that people do. And now it's been brought back as being recognised as something that is, of course, really important. And it very much is a focus of in things like clinical psychology, and but also in forensic psychology, counselling psychology, health psychology. It's become ever more important to recognise that our personal lived experiences are what define us as individuals, and to ignore them is rather pointless. And the other side of it is the hermeneutics, which is the researcher's perspective of the interpretation of what people say about their lived experiences. Because it's all right having what people talk about, what they say about their lived experiences, but in order for us to understand it as psychologists, we have to try and overlay perhaps some psychological concepts or theory to make it something that is more coherent. Because although people can talk about their lives, what they say is often not structured well or clearly in terms of how things might fit together and how we might actually understand what's going on. And so that's the additional bit. It's the taking people's lives, but then actually trying to interpret them in a more theoretical perspective, perhaps. So we've got two sides to it. We've got the description that comes from the participants, and we've got the interpretation that, well, actually there's more than one level of interpretation. There's the interpretation of the researcher trying to understand what the individuals are saying. But of course, there's the interpretation of the participant themselves, of their own lived experience and their translation of their experiences into language. Unlike any other qualitative investigation, though, is the idea that the researcher is really trying to get a feeling for what it's like to walk in the shoes, as it's often described, of the participant, to what it's like for that participant to have experienced their life events. So really trying to immerse themselves in the things that the participant has experienced. But of course, despite the fact that that's what they're trying to do, we know that that's not truly possible because we haven't experienced it. But it's trying to get that bit further under the skin of the data. So I said there's the interpretation of the researcher, but yeah, there is also the interpretation of the participant. Everything that we do, we can't help interpreting our own lives. It's just part of the human condition that we go through our lives interpreting our experiences and making sense for ourselves of what happens. Now, of course, the sense that we make of our lives, particularly at times of trauma, difficulty, mental ill health and things like that, is perhaps not the best or most coherent interpretation that might be going. And so part of the process that we have here is that the researcher interprets the interpretation to try and add more meaning or fuller understanding of what's going on. So the participant is saying something and the researcher is listening to what they're saying, understanding what they're saying, hopefully, and then trying to order it into something that can make more sense and can also be incorporated with what other people who have experienced similar things have said. So IPA can be done on case studies for individual participants, but you will more often than not see more than one participant in a study. Because we are looking to perhaps draw information from one or from more than one person's views or interpretations of their own experiences to get something of a fuller picture. And then I've just added on the last line here that, of course, because as a reader of a research study on IPA, you're also interpreting the interpretation presented by the researcher. And so it's kind of like a third interpretation of it, because you may well read it and think, well, I'm not sure that that's exactly the point, or that's not the way that should fit together, or the interpretation that you've used there doesn't seem appropriate, or something like that. So we're adding another level of interpretation, and that's something that's kind of unavoidable as well. But you have to stop somewhere, otherwise you've got interpretations on interpretations on interpretations. So what's the role of the researcher in IPA? Well, it's a very active role in IPA. It's more active, in fact, in IPA than it is in other qualitative methodologies, and just far more active than it is in quantitative research, where the researcher is actually viewed as someone who's not really involved. Is this recording, Prasanthi? I hope so. I certainly clicked on record, so I hope it is. I think I'm getting to be a bit of an expert now, so I'm confident. You've made me think now. You've cast doubt in my own mind. So in quantitative research, the researcher is expected to be divorced from the actual processes that are the data collection. There should be absolutely no influence of the researcher on the data in a quantitative study. Now, there's plenty of arguments to go around that that's not the case, and you can find those all over the place, the influence of experimenter effects and things like that. But in IPA, the researcher is actually actively involved by design. They have to work sometimes to get access to the data from the participant, to get them to explain. That's an interesting question. Does the researcher need to have had no prior understanding or contact with the subject they are studying? And I'll come on to that actually on this slide. It is that so the researcher has to get actively involved to draw out the data, and they're actively involved in the interpretation as well, when they make sense of the lived world of the participant. So should they have had no prior understanding or contact? Well, in many cases, when you're conducting this kind of research, it's hard to have not had some knowledge, experience, even if not first-hand, of what you are looking at. And of course, if you're doing a number of interviews in IPA, then once you've done the first one, well, actually, you've got suddenly a huge wealth of knowledge that you have acquired from doing the first interview. And what you have to do, and this is not an easy process, is that you have to suspend your preconceptions, if you do have any, before you even go into the first interview, and really focus on what the participant is saying. Is there a way to spot and eliminate researcher bias in IPA? Well, there is in one respect, in that when you are drawing up your guide for your interview questions, then you should have these thoroughly checked by an independent person, someone who is not part of the research that you're doing, just to see the sorts of questions that you're asking, because it's very easy to actually use questions that do identify preconceptions, and it's not always the case that as an individual you might realise that you're including those preconceptions. So that's one way that you can do it. The other way that you can do it is, of course, once the interview has been transcribed, it would be possible to actually see what's been said and then make judgments based on that. So, Mark, yes, so a researcher could easily do a study in a field that they come from, but they have to, just as you say, suspend their preconceptions of the area to maintain their independence in the research process. So they are actively involved because they have to be to get under the surface of what the participant is saying, but they must suspend all of their own thoughts. And it is a really difficult thing to do, because when you're listening to somebody and you hear somebody say something and you're interpreting it, your thoughts and your preconceptions are going to be jumping around in the back of your mind, trying to take control. And you've got to try and keep away from that if you can. So it does make it an interesting challenge. So, how do you come up with what you're going to do for your IPA study? Well, one thing that is very important about all qual studies, and particularly so for IPA, is that you are not going about testing some specific hypothesis. I often think of the difference between quantitative and qualitative research, and use an analogy of the difference between the English and the French justice system. So in the UK, we have a justice system which is confrontational. It's about innocence or guilt, and you go to the courtroom and you have prosecutors and defendants who are trying to, if you like, prove their position. It's like testing hypotheses. You either prove it for one side or you prove it for the other, which we don't quite do in psychology, but that's the thing. It's like quantitative research, it's like a decision on one side or a decision on the other. Whereas the French legal system is set up where the point of the process, judicial process, is to find the truth. Now, the truth might end up with somebody, being guilty or innocent, but it isn't this confrontational, combative, adversarial system that we have the same in the UK. And I think that makes a useful sort of analogy for the quant-qual design. One, you're looking to answer, to test a hypothesis, to find out whether it's true or false. In the other, you're not doing that. You're looking for truth. You're looking to endeavour to find the truth. And just to get back to your comment again, Mark, about doing something like this for your thesis, that would be absolutely fine. Yeah, if you're in an area, you could do something in an area you're in, and then you've just got the challenge of making sure that you maintain that independence. Well, as Apani, when you say you don't blindly believe the proof, well, I suppose in qualitative research, you don't look for proof so much as truth of experience. You're not necessarily trying to prove anything, you're just trying to get to the truth of the experience itself, what people have actually felt. Importantly, Prasantha, the evidence is purely dependent on the interview of the participant, on the data that you've collected. That's all you have to work with, is what the people say. And that's why the interviews are really, really important as well, in terms of the way that they are conducted, the questions that you ask, and such as that. One thing that I often find challenging from a supervisor point of view of studies of this kind is that sometimes students think that they don't have to engage with the research literature to come up with their idea. They just think, oh, it's a qualitative study, I can just pluck an idea out of the air, of that seems interesting, I'll go and investigate that. And it's not the way that qualitative studies should be developed. They should be developed, and one of the sort of key elements generally of when you write up an IPA study or any kind of qualitative study is that you have a literature review, and at the end of your literature review you make the case for the gap in the literature that your study will be able to fill. So I've reviewed the literature and whoa, here's a hole in the literature that hasn't been answered. And my qualitative study, my IPA study, can actually aim to start to fill that hole. So they're developed on what people have done previously, and they might be developed on quantitative research that's been done previously as well. There's no issue about that, about saying I want to do a qualitative study in this area because these quantitative studies say this, but there is no deeper investigation into the personal experiences of the people who these quantitative researchers have been talking about, and so there's a gap in the literature there to get in. And so you end up doing something that has not been done before based on what has been done before. But whichever way you want to carve it, you've got to engage yourself with that research literature first to read around to see what people have done and what they haven't done. Absolutely, Norma. The idea basically is to contribute to knowledge. That is absolutely what we are trying to do. We're trying to do that whether it's quant or qual, but yeah, absolutely, we are trying to provide some additional knowledge to our understanding of the area. So, sampling in IPA, I said that sometimes you can see case studies. One thing that is for sure is that large samples are not appropriate. So there's an interesting question, John. You can use a qualitative method and get an MSc. Absolutely you can. Absolutely you can. Psychology now welcomes and recognises the value of qualitative research as a scientific method of investigation, because it doesn't have numbers involved in it, but it has very clear foundations, it has very clear guidelines as to what you should be doing and as to the approach that you take and the verification processes. So it's still absolutely fine. So, Natasha, it could be around alien abduction. Yeah, absolutely it could be around alien abduction. Alien abduction is a thing. Well, I say it's a thing. I don't believe that people actually get abducted by aliens, but experiences of alien abduction is a thing. So you could certainly investigate that by interviewing people about their experiences and understanding of their alien abduction. I don't know anybody who's been abducted by aliens. Mind you, in this last few months, I feel like I might have been abducted by aliens and put into some alternative universe, but perhaps not. So, Mark, literature, could it go out to autobiographers? Right, so if you mean an autobiographical book, no. Apart from to perhaps use an occasional quote to indicate what somebody has written about themselves. But the research literature should be the published papers about the area. Okay, so Hayden, that's a good question about whether you have to discuss theoretical perspectives like constructivism and ontology, epistemology in the thesis. Typically, you will see a limited amount of information, perhaps, on that when you read qualitative papers. And so that you wouldn't be expected to go in depth on it, but you might put a little bit in there. So everybody likes the idea of alien abduction. Okay, so Mark, if you're having difficulty finding something academic on what you're interested in, one thing that we can do, and I'd be happy to talk about this outside of this session, of course, is think about the area that your particular interest lies in. And there might be something in an associated area that you can use as a research literature in terms of, well, this isn't what I'm interested in, but the concepts or the theories underlying it might be related. So this does happen when somebody comes up with something that is relatively new. Just because something is relatively new doesn't mean that it shouldn't be researched, but it does mean that it's a bit harder to find that research base that you do need to actually get to where you want to go. But it's not to say that it's not possible. I'm happy to take it outside of this meeting if you want to discuss it. Does the assignment require us to use NVivo? No. I was going to show you NVivo when I had access to NVivo and all of my materials, but as I've lost all of that and I've had to restructure what I've been doing, you don't need to use NVivo. If you've used NVivo before, then I'm more than happy for you to use it, but it's not essential. And on Friday in the session, when I go through the data, I'm not going to use NVivo. I'm just going to use color coding and things like that to show you the way that it's perhaps more easily done. What is NVivo, Prasanthi? NVivo is a piece of software for qualitative analysis. The thing about qualitative analysis tools is they still don't do the analysis for you. So the way that SPSS, you bang the numbers in, you click the mouse, and the answer comes out. With NVivo, it doesn't actually give you the answer. You've still got to work with the data. You've still got to do the identification of codes, of themes, and that sort of thing. It's just a way of organising your analysis in a way that doesn't mean you've got 100 pieces of paper perhaps lying around and more highlighters than you could shake a stick at. But you don't need it for the assignment at all. Yes, Mark. Well, you never know. Machine learning may well get better in terms of qualitative analysis one day. You never know. Rob, you make a very, very good point about the data, and it might be something that I mention at some point later about feeling closer to the data by typing out the transcript. I mean, the general... It's interesting. This is quite an interesting thing, actually, about qualitative research. When we've got PhD students who are doing qualitative studies, then the general guidance for them is that for the first study they do, they should transcribe the data themselves, all the data themselves. For subsequent studies that they do, they should transcribe one of the interviews or something like that, and then get somebody else to do the rest of the transcriptions. And the reason that we say that, the reason that I say that is that it's very time consuming. And it could be that the researchers could be spending their time doing other things like writing papers for publication or such than doing the transcription. However, it does mean that you're taking yourself away from the data, and I think that that's a shame. So you do have this sort of conflict between doing all the transcription yourself and realising that you've just lost the will to live because you've spent months of your time transcribing data. Okay, can we use filmed interviews if the participants are happy? So do you mean can you film the interview? Yes, you can film interviews. It's all about consent. It's all about ethical approval. What you would perhaps want to do for filming purposes, if you want to film them, is perhaps justify the reasons for wanting to actually film your participants as opposed to just audio record them. And it might be that you want to focus on body language and emotional expressions in their faces, as well as what they're saying. Because particularly the face can obviously be a very, very expressive and emotional tool that could be brought into the data analysis. It adds an extra level of difficulty to you as the researcher, but it's certainly something that can be done. And obviously, of course, interpretation of body language and interpretation of facial expressions, you would have to link that with what they were saying as well, because we are still at a stage where the spoken word is a lot more expressive, or perhaps not expressive, perhaps reliable in terms of interpretation than expressions or body language, certainly in the considerations of current researchers. So anyway, back to sampling. IPA, typically you might see around 6 participants. The important thing about the sample is that it's most definitely not a random sample, it's a purposive sample, generally homogeneous, not always, but generally, because what you want is to have your participants for whom the research is relevant and they have the experiences that are similar in kind to be able to talk about. So you've got to be purposive about who you get. You can't just have anybody, because otherwise you'd be interviewing people about stuff about which they know nothing. And actually that kind of reminds me of it. One that I supervised just this year, an undergraduate project that was used at IPA and was looking at mental health and mental health support in British seafarers, so people who are in the merchant navy, spending a lot of time at sea. And one of her interviews was effectively null and void because they didn't talk about the issues. They said everything was fine, and I think she got some really good data from the rest of them, but I think it also demonstrated a little bit of her naivety as an undergraduate student, that she didn't use the interview to actually investigate further why one of the participants was just saying everything's fine, no issues, and try and just get a little bit more under the skin. But it did mean that she had an interviewee that didn't give anything away. Is it possible to interview people you know, or does that get too subjective? It is possible. I've known people interview people that they know before, particularly when it's an issue about which it might be difficult to actually obtain other participants. The challenges then, of course, are, again, inflated because you know the person, and so you've got so many more preconceptions perhaps about the individual and their experiences than you would have with people you don't know. And so suspending those and keeping on track and asking the right questions that might be, in some cases, challenging, difficult, emotional, becomes harder. But I've certainly known it to be the case. Okay, data collection. Family members, Hayden, again, the same principle. It's someone you know, and so it can be done. I think that what you have to do is to justify the reasons why you need to use people that you know, and if you can do that, then there's no reason why you can't. But it shouldn't be that you use family members simply because it's easier to get hold of them, and there needs to be a good reason as to why. And ethical permission is of course required for all the research, irrespective of how you go about it anyway. So interviews or focus groups. I would recommend interviews for IPA, because focus groups, you've got this possibility for the influence of the other members in the focus groups. It's always a potential problem in focus groups, is that you get someone who sort of leads the charge in the group. You've got someone who's the dominant personality. And then you get other people sort of sing with what they're saying, or indeed just not saying very much themselves. So I would certainly go with the interview wherever possible. One of the big things about when you do this sort of research is data protection is a big issue, because if you do an interview, and especially if you're filming them, you've got data of a very personal nature that can easily identify the participant. You do not want to be losing that. So secure storage is absolutely critical. And it's interesting that we normally say that the secure place to store your stuff is on the university U drive. I don't know as I could say that anymore, but that was always our go-to place. But you want it somewhere that is very secure, password protected. Certainly not sticking it on memory sticks or things like that you can lose, get stolen, or the encryption tends not to be particularly good. Some kind of cloud-based storage, iCloud or something like that. Keep it safe out the way. And the other thing is that you also have to identify when you're going to get rid of it and how you're going to get rid of it. Typically, for an MSc thesis, the raw data would be destroyed following the completion of the program, so that it can't suddenly come to light in 6 years' time when you've forgotten about it and all of a sudden it appears somewhere. The only reason why it might be kept longer than that is if there was a possibility of it being presented at a conference or used for a publication in a journal, in which case we have to then keep it longer. But the advice then would be for you to give it to your supervisor to store, so that effectively they can be responsible for the data. So can you submit your MSc thesis to journals or publications? Yes, you certainly can. We have a number published each year from both undergraduate and postgraduate students. There's quite a bit of work between the thesis and the publication, because although the style is more or less the same, the length of the thesis is longer than a journal article will be, and what you have to do is identify the journal that you want it to go in, and then you find out that actually the format of that journal is different to the format of the thesis. Because, as you know, I'm just looking around different journals, they have different styles, they have different referencing styles, they have different lengths, all sorts of various different things. So it's a pain in the neck. You think, great, I can get this published, but it's not a question of just submitting your thesis to the journal. You have to go working for it. Well, there you go. So you'll be doing all right. So all interviews are question and answer style, but the questions have got to be fluid and the answers have got to be in depth. So they can't be yes or no's. A lot of students seem to think that interviewing is going to be quite easy, and it really, really isn't. It's quite hard because of the depth of information that you need to get out of your participants. Your participants are not like some damned river waiting to be breached. And, you know, I've often known students go into their first interview and then come out of it and go, well, that didn't go very well, I didn't really get much there. And it's like, you know, they go in with this expectation that they're going to ask the first question, and the participants are sending a huge wealth of really rich data. A lot of people aren't like that. You need to get them going. You might need to warm them up for one thing, get them chatting a bit before you actually start the interview so that they feel a bit more at their ease. So try and talk about something that is got nothing to do with the research. Giving them tea and biscuits, that's generally quite a nice thing to do. Just anything to sort of put them at their ease, because often, although they're happy to be there, they don't know what it is that you want. So, Glenn, quantitative data is loads easier to get as a general principle, depending on exactly what your study is. But using things like online data collection tools like Qualtrics, and there's online experiment builders that we can use, that actually getting quantitative data is loads easier than getting qualitative data, and it's loads easier to analyse as well. Well, yeah, if you're asking somebody about something so much, if they come from a secretive industry or background, if you're looking into something like that, then, or that's where they work, then they're probably very reticent at talking about things and careful about what they say. So, yeah, it is a challenge. And I don't mean to put people off, because qualitative research can provide some really, really good studies. As I said, this one from the girl who did the one on the mental health of seafarers was fantastic. Got a mark of 85%, I think, for it. It was, you know, a really, really good piece of work. So it's all done. It's all doable. Qualitative in politics, bloody hell, I don't know if you'd ever find the truth. It's not politics. Though they do all like to talk. So you've got the benefit of they all want to talk a lot, so you have got that side of it nailed. Typical interview, you want it to be about an hour. If it's only about 20 minutes, you'll find there's not much detail in it. When you're interviewing, don't be shy, don't be hesitant to revisit areas to try and get more detail. So if somebody talks a little bit about something, and then you move on to something else, don't worry about saying, you know, you were talking about that a few minutes ago. Can you just tell me a little bit more about that? Don't think, oh, we've stopped talking about that, I can't go back to it. You can. But if they do just completely refuse to talk about stuff, you have got to accept it. You can't twist their arm around the back until they talk. But most are reasonably happy to talk about stuff, because they have offered to take part in your research. So, you know, they are a consenting adult taking part in your study, and so you'd expect that they are happy to talk about things. And it's just that they don't always know what it is that you kind of expecting them to talk about, or the way that you're going to talk about it. And you'd have to prompt them a bit more. So your questions, they must be open-ended. If you use closed questions, you've gone through your whole interview and you've got 10 words. Yes, no, yes, yes, no, yes. Nothing qualitative in that. Free from hidden presumptions. Don't go asking questions like, well, what is it then that makes you dislike the police? You know, it's like you can't overlay their dislike for the police and say that, you know, because they might think, well, I didn't really know that I did, but now you've asked me that question, I'll have to talk about it in that way. So do be careful. you need an outline plan, and you always have to submit an outline plan as part of your ethics submission that basically says this is the broad questions that I'm going to ask them, so that the ethics committee can see the sorts of areas that you're going to be asking about. But the specifics will change within the actual interview process itself, because it depends on what the interviewee says. You've got to be fleet of foot when you're interviewing, and move from different approaches to different approaches. Always have a list of prompts and follow-up questions on a piece of paper next to you that you're always ready to use, and that you can adapt to any sort of answer that they get. And these are just things like, can you tell me a little bit more about that? How did that make you feel at the time? How do you feel about that now? And things like that, so that you try to get more detail. Be ready for periods of silence. Got to say that I actually hate periods of silence, and will be far too eager to jump in and start talking myself. Periods of silence, the participant might just be thinking about exactly how to talk about something that's really difficult. But you can use, I'm not sure about I know your acronyms, Natasha. TED 5WH. Tell, explain, describe. Well, that's the sort of thing that the thing that you want to be doing. I mean, the explain is the thing that you really want. Who, what, where, when. It depends on what it is that you're exactly talking about. But I wouldn't want to particularly fix that closely on going in that way. I think that you want to think about what is it that you want to find out about, and use your questions around what it is that you want to, what it is that you actually want to find out about, so that you'll understand more about the person. And some of those things don't always fit into that particular thing, and you don't want to think, well, I haven't asked them this sort of question, I really ought to. Always be driven by what it is that you want to know. A lot of researchers say that active listening is a real key part of conducting a good interview. Obviously, you've got to be attentive. You've got to listen to what it is that people are saying. But at the same time, when you're talking about things that are quite difficult concepts, people can be talking quite a lot, but you might be listening, but not necessarily understanding what it is that they're saying. So you have to actively be focusing on understanding what it is that's being said. And when you don't understand, be prepared to go back in and ask them to clarify what it is that they're saying. Say that. Be prepared to say, I didn't quite understand what you said then. Could you put that another way? Exactly what did you mean there? And that means that you've got to be prepared, ready to actually construct perhaps new questions that are appropriate to one person, one individual at one particular time on one particular area on the hoof, just to be able to explore what's being said. And this is sometimes an area where students fall down, is that they have their question guide very much almost like a counsellor, Michelle. If you are anybody who is a counsellor, will find IPA research right up your street, really, because it's the sort it requires a lot of the skills that you use on a regular basis. But you've got to be ready to be reflexive. And a lot of students, as I say, often this is something they fall down on. They have their interview sort of guide and they follow it too closely because it's like, well, I now move on to that bit or whatever. So just some sort of example questions about health, the sorts of things, feelings, interpretations, thoughts. Trying to get the individual to come over with their answers of their experience. Think. It's about trying to get inside their heads, or trying to get them to share the inside of their head with you. So it's trying to get them to share their private side about things, which is obviously something that can be a challenge to them. So thoughts, feelings, interpretations, experiences. That's what you want to be asking them about. I've still got messages coming in like crazy about Blackboard and similar, but anyway. You've always got to be prepared that you can ask questions that on certain issues that people just won't want to talk about because they might feel awkward, they might be ashamed, they might become emotional. This happens. And again, if you're trained in counselling, it can be really, really useful because you be able to deal with these people at such times. Most qualitative researchers are not trained in counselling whatsoever, and you've always got to be ready to pause the interview. You've always got to be ready to perhaps halt the interview and stop it. It doesn't happen very often, but it does happen sometimes. You've got to be prepared for that. You can't say, look, you said you'd take part, we're going to plough on to the very end in some Milgram-esque fashion that you're in now, you can't get out. The other thing that you've always got to be prepared for is if you are asking about something that might raise emotional issues or anything like that, have information on sources of further help and advice ready, able to be shared with the participants so that they don't go off in a manner where they feel that they have come out of the research experience in a worse state than they were when they went in. And this is part of the debriefing process as well. Is one of the absolute things that we must do is we must never send participants away feeling that the research has been a negative experience for them. Absolutely key. So, Heidi, are you allowed to ask for scales when measuring emotion feelings on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the least? Well, you could say that, but what you've got to think beyond that then in terms of what did it mean? What did that extent of emotion mean to them? Because the sort of 1 to 10 scale means something to them, but it doesn't mean anything to the external understanding of their experience. You know, if they were to say, you know, on a scale of 1 to 10, how did it make you feel? And they say 10. They say, well, can you explain then how that actually made you feel emotionally, bodily, your interactions with others, and this sort of thing, so that you're getting the richness out of them. Because if you were reading a report of a study and they said they were a 10, the reader would be going, what does that mean? You know, I've no idea. I don't understand their experience there. Apart from it seems to be very high. So you've got to, you know, if you were to use it, well, it's not the sort of thing that I would see being used, but if you used it, you'd have to sort of follow it up with getting in there. Yes, Laura, regarding ethics, would you need to evidence these considerations in the ethic? You would have to do it in your ethics submission when you're doing something that is a sensitive subject. So when you submit for ethics, there are 3 different levels of submission that you can go in for: green, amber, and red. Green, we don't have any green submissions in psychology because effectively there's no research that doesn't involve people, and green submissions are for things like chemists and biologists and things like that, where they're doing the ethical considerations are much reduced because there's no people actually involved. So we have either amber or red. Amber is where you are doing your research with people, but you aren't doing anything that involves data of a personal, private, or sensitive nature, which is a lot of psychological research. A lot of qualitative research, or not a lot of qualitative research, but some qualitative research will certainly be red. It depends on what you're investigating, but it's always going to have something of a personal nature because you've got individuals there, but it might also be sensitive. It just depends on what you're doing, but probably it'd end up being red because it's personal data. And when that goes in for review, it just depends. That leads to how many people actually review your ethics submission as well. Red gets reviewed by more people than amber than green. Okay. So there's 3 levels of transcription. I'll just sort of flick over these first 2 actually because we'd never use them in qualitative research. But edited transcription is where you just take the sense out of what they're saying and present that. So anything that doesn't make sense or grammatically incorrect, you leave out. We never do that in qualitative research. We don't use intelligent transcription either, which is sort of like light editing, where you take out the ums and the ers and the got it's and things like that. So we don't do that, but it's certainly a way of transcription. Kirthi, can we incentivize the participants in? No, that would actually be very unethical, really, to hope that by incentivizing your participants, they will give you better data. That would certainly be not be ethical. We don't use incentives for research participation anyway, but to actually think, if you were taking a position of thinking, right, I'll tell you what, if I pay them more, they'll give me better data, then that would certainly be unethical, and it would also, in many respects, challenge the value of the data that you were getting, because you're kind of tempting them to say whatever they think they might want you to say to get the cash. We use verbatim transcription, which means everything goes in, including non-verbal components can certainly be added in. Most of the time you don't see a lot of the non-verbal stuff, but if it was something that you're interested in, then it's absolutely fine. Generally, people focus on what people say, pauses, perhaps emotional tenor, umming, ahhing, all of those sorts of things go into the verbatim transcription. So it's everything that you've got on your recording that's coming into your ears. Now, of course, if you're using video as well, you've got everything that's going in your ears, but you've got all that stuff going in your eyes, and it'll make the transcript even bigger. But that is an important element. We always use verbatim transcription. So as I say, you should number each line, you should clearly identify each speaker. You don't see Jeffersonian conventions very often in qualitative psychological research, apart from perhaps detailed conversation analysis, discourse analysis, and this is because they are really complex and time-consuming, and it's all about the amount of emphasis that people put on certain words, or indeed certain syllables in words, whether the voice pitch is rising through a sentence or falling through a sentence or a word. Really, really complicated stuff. I wouldn't expect anybody to do that sort of thing for certainly for an MSc psychology thesis because of the level of complexity that's involved in there. But it is just a further way that you can do it. Okay. So the analysis, it can be complex and time-consuming. You've got to get immersed in the data. When you're doing IPA, the general expectation is that you actually sort of flip between your sense-making and the participant's sense-making. So it's a kind of an iterative process. You're trying to look on both sides. First of all, you've got to take what's being said at face value, but then you might try and think about it from a more conceptual perspective, but then you have to go back to what they're saying to get the full rounded sort of picture. And so it's, as I say, it's iterative. It takes time. You have to think about what you're doing. You can't just start at the top of the transcripts and work your way through it once and think, well, that's that done. You want to read it through first of all without thinking of making any notes, really, and then take it from there. And you also need to be careful, depending on where the research is being undertaken and who your participants are and what the topic is, that you've got to be careful about overlaying perhaps Western theoretical constructs onto Eastern participants' experiences and views, because actually they may not be relevant in terms of the way that the experience is represented in different cultures. And that is something that's growing nowadays in sort of a worldview of psychology. Forever, psychology has been massively dominated by Europe, particularly the UK, and the US. And it is growing now worldwide, but we have to actually take on board, as it grows, the fact that theoretical constructs can be culture dependent. So, as I say, try reading the transcript without making any notes first of all. And if you didn't do the transcription yourself and an audio recording is still available, then listen to it. And then start to make notes as you go through it again. Simple observations or reflections or things that you think might be of particular significance, and go through them. So this is some data that's drawn from a paper about IPA to demonstrate these things, and I think it's okay, but I think you'll get more out of Friday's session when I go through the data that's actually for the assignment to see how it fits. But I'll go through it now anyway. So just sort of going through and looking at a transcript and pulling out some of the things that actually go on. So this was done with this piece of research. It was published paper that was done on Tibetan refugees living in northeast India. Is that where Tibet is? Anyway, and that's the people that it was done with, and it was about ill health in these people. And so, interviewer, can you tell me about the last time you were ill? Participant, it was long ago. By the grace of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, I haven't had any problems recently. When I arrived here 10 years ago, well, even I had a small, spirit harm. My points to his genitals, my organ got swollen and it was itching. I did not pay attention to it at first, but after a few days it got worse. I had sort of pain when I was trying to pee, and I was really worried. So the first notes that were pulled out for this were, he attributes good fortune to the Dalai Lama. So does this reflect his beliefs, or is it just a cliche term that he uses? He attributes his illness to spirits. Perhaps he doesn't know the word penis or is ashamed to use it. That's just another sort of, so is there some emotional thing going on there as well? And from another perspective, he got worried as his symptoms got worse. So it's taking out the sort of basics that are in there and just playing them back in simpler terms. So we've got good fortune, Dalai Lama, illness, spirits, worry and symptoms. Why do you think that the symptom appeared? Now, he starts off his answer, well, many reasons are possible. So it would indicate that he believes that there are many different explanations for his problem. But then he goes on to talk about just one. What I thought at that time and what I think now, two different reasons. I mean, we used to piss everywhere you see, in a spring, on a tree, we used to pee near that. And sometimes my organ penis swells, and when I go to a lama, he says, this is harm of Nagas because you did something wrong. So they would tell me to do this prayer, and I do. So he's talking about different explanations, but he's focusing on one. And again, he's reinforced in this idea that the symptoms that he's experiencing are some kind of spirit punishment. So, can you tell me how you interpreted your health problems? So trying to get some interpretation from the participant. Again, he talks about, I thought it was the curse of Nagas, serpent deities, very powerful, the living spirit, and all this sort of thing. Very much, again, focusing on this one folk belief explanation, offending the spirits and being cursed, and that these skin problems are a consequence of that. So although he's talked about there being different explanations, he's only really focusing on one. So the interviewer is listening to this, but he recognised that actually you said there was loads of different explanations. You've only talked about one. So he comes back to it. He revisits the question. What else might have caused your problem? You mentioned another reason, which he did, but he didn't talk about. So by doing that, it's got the participant to actually revisit it, and he revisits it in a very, very different way. Well, it's like, I may have slept with another woman who may have had some problems, like a prostitute, for instance. It's like, now this is a really interesting thing that his initial explanation and consideration of his problem was to do with spirits. And now when he's been asked again, he's come down to a behavioural explanation about maybe sleeping with a prostitute. And when he comes to thinking about it that way, his embarrassment is shown a little bit more, but he also talks about going to a doctor. Maybe Nagas or maybe bacteria. Sometimes we have these talks, a nurse or a doctor comes, they talk about bacteria, wash your hands, use a condom. So what you've got here is an explanation of a Western medical explanation for his problems, that although he had it available to him and he said there was more than one explanation, it was the second one that he came to. But by revisiting it, you get to hear it. So from those basic notes, you then sort of start to work more with these notes than the transcript itself to get the emerging themes that are coming out. And if the notes are detailed enough, then they should reflect the source material, the transcript itself. So it's fine to be working with these notes to develop these themes. You're sort of going up a level of abstraction. And sometimes it can be difficult to pull these things together. And that's why you have to work through this in an iterative process. If we think about this transcript again, though, so going from notes to themes, just cutting down on making up, the themes are a bit broader explanations of what we've got in the notes. So attributing good fortune to religious blessing and attributing illness to supernatural forces. Summarises the notes which summarise or are pulled out from the transcript. So they're easier to get your head round, perhaps. Moving on, holding different explanatory models. Well, he does, but he refers to the folk beliefs to rationalise his illness. So he says there are many reasons possible, so he holds different explanatory models, but he refers to the folk beliefs. And then when he moves on, he's still talking about the folk beliefs that underpin his interpretation of the cause of his illness and his skin problems. So, Natasha, would we count this as supernatural rather than religious? I think that is a point that you could happily debate as to which way round you might want to frame it. I'm using the framing that the people in the article used, but it's like there are no fixeds in qualitative, and you have to take on various different approaches. So then moving on to the last one, you've got the embarrassment coming out regarding his personal behaviour. So he's kind of talking about his personal behaviour, and he's obviously embarrassed about it. He's like, I may have slept with some prostitutes, for instance, which it's like it's not something he particularly want to come out early, but he has done. But once he's done that, he then uses Western conceptualizations to explain illness, and it's not something that is sort of appears in the paper that as I've read it. But then you've got this perhaps thing that you can build from that the idea that sleeping with prostitutes is a westernization and is associated with Western explanations of illness, but not related to the folk belief for explanations of illness. Presumably, a researcher would need to try and not superimpose Western illness. Yeah, exactly. You don't want to. It's exactly the problem that you've got, is that you don't want to superimpose these Western beliefs over the thing. And the researcher's not trying to be judgmental here. What they're trying to do is to understand what it is that the person is saying, and that's you go through these notes and themes to sort of say, well, is this what they are saying? Maria, yeah, IPA is very similar to reading themes and meaning behind words in English literature. It's the application to it of, if you like, in many respects, the same processes to the words that people say about what they are talking about. But it's certainly not about, you certainly should not be making any personal judgments about it, but that doesn't mean that you can't say that this is what the data appears to say. And you say this is what the data appears to say. You're not saying, and I think that's a really bad thing. It's just that this is what the data appears to say. Is there a thin line? It depends on what you're talking about. Yes, there certainly can be a thin line between them, which is perhaps why talking about certain things is more difficult than others. If the researcher were to derive that the participant finds it wrong to pee in the Naux live, but not wrong to go to a prostitute, would that be a researcher bias? Not if what you derive from it is that the participant finds it wrong to pee in a lake where the Naux live, but not wrong to go to a prostitute. That's not researcher's bias. It's if that's what the person has said, that's what they have said. Now, I'm not sure that is what the participant has said here. They've indicated that the peeing in the lake where the Nagus live may have caused the disease, and they've indicated that going to a prostitute may give the disease. But the participant hasn't indicated the, if you like, fundamental right or wrong of it particularly. The researcher most certainly shouldn't say that one is right and one is wrong. But you've got to try and draw out what it is exactly that the participant is saying. So, Mark, the discussion is certainly somewhere where you can bring more stuff in. Absolutely. Absolutely. In the discussion. Well, yeah, Aparna, it would be... It's certainly a lot easier if you've got a lot more information to actually work on, and these are very, very short snippets from out of the transcript, and it's perhaps not the best example to use, but it kind of works okay. Can the researcher go back and confirm the interviewee replied to their answer at a later date? So, Michelle, are you saying you do the interview, you do the analysis, and then you go back to your interviewee and say, "This is what I pulled out. Is this what you meant?" Is that what you're asking? Yeah. Well, what I'm asking, Michelle, if you can hear me, is: are you saying that you do your analysis and then take your findings back to the participant for confirmation? That recursive pattern doesn't normally happen. You don't normally go back to your participants and say, "This is what I pulled out." You normally work on the data that you have. No, it's not. I can't think of many situations where that is done, and typically, I think that what you would get is a very recursive process. It might be done with the standard practice. Wouldn't be the standard practice. Okay, so when you've got your themes out, you then need to cluster your themes together to get them to all sort of fit together. You could have two questions, interesting questions here. So, could you do a repeated measures qualitative research? That's an interesting question. Yes, you could. I would think the time between the two interviews, I'm guessing, but I'm sure that you could. Could you have a follow-up interview to seek clarification? You can have follow-up interviews if what they have said is not clear to you, rather than for them to confirm that they agree with what you have derived from the interview. Would be standard. Yeah, so the next level of clarification is you cluster your themes together and get an increase or a decrease in detail and an increase in overarching themes. So in this case, you might have, from what he's said, this individual holds conflicting explanatory models of health and disease. And there are certain conditions around good luck and health. There are certain indigenous beliefs to conceptualize illness, and also Western conceptualizations to explain illness. So what you've got here is you have an individual who has these who holds conflicting explanatory models to explain his experience of health and illness. And they can be split down into those 3 different things, which can then be split down into the more specific notes or codes, which can be exemplified by parts of the text. And when you write up an IPA study, you typically describe a theme, provide supporting quotes because they allow the reader to assess your interpretations. It's like, I'm saying there is this theme here, this quote exemplifies it. The reader can think, yeah, I reckon you're probably right there, or not. And it also retains the voice of the participant, which is important because that's what it's all about. Then you'll have interpretive comments from the researcher that go beyond what the person has said, but is how the researcher is interpreting what they said and why. And then you go on to actually discuss your findings in the light of previous research. So there's sort of several levels to doing it. And they provide this element from the paper. So, trying to rationalise the onset of his illness, Lobsang initially referred to the traditional indigenous beliefs of the culture he represented, and then you've got that quote that's provided. Stories about certain deities have been part of everyday life and social discourse in the Tibetan diaspora. So you've got the researcher then putting his interpretation on this. So this is something that they are saying, well, this is why they're embedded in their system of beliefs, etc., etc., etc. So there's more detail to understand what is going on. And so it comes to the end there. As such, serpent deities, powerful, dangerous, potentially oppressive for those who cross the taboo, can represent inner objects which are projected and used to control the behaviour of body, speech, and mind. And so it overlays what's going on. Could you conduct a written survey prior to interviews to reinforce findings? What you tend to do is you tend to do it the other way around, Michelle, often. Often qualitative studies are used to permit the development of a quantitative survey based on what your participants have said. So if you're investigating a new area, or there's not been research done in it, then the typical view is often, well, the survey won't get to the crux of the matter. We do the qualitative research first, and then we analyse what the people said, and then we create a survey based on what's been said, and develop questionnaires based on that. So then you, if you like, you validate your qualitative study using your quantitative tools later. Okay, so yeah, it's an interesting suggestion that you could use a survey to guide the interviews to gain more on the area. But I think that what you want to be doing is you want to be starting off your research from that naive perspective of you will find what you will find by asking questions around their experiences. Rather than, if you sort of had a survey first, you run the risk of having this preconceived idea of what you're going to ask about, because this is the sort of thing that you might be finding information on. You're better off starting it from a more naive perspective of, I'm interested in this area, and I will ask them questions that will hopefully get them to talk about their area. Okay, and so you see, I was sure I was going to get done in an hour today. So Friday, we could be back on Blackboard. Woo woo. Who knows? But what I'm going to do on Friday is I'm going to work through some of the transcript that you are going to be using for the assignment. And I'm going to be pulling out ideas as I see them. And hopefully, if you've already read it, you'll be able to contribute your ideas to the identification of notes, themes, whatever, as I'm going through it. And they might be different to mine. And that's absolutely fine because, well, for a start, it's not a piece of my research, so I'm not beholden to it. And I'm more than happy for people. But what I'd like to think is that people can talk about these things, and then you'll probably see how there is a sort of a coalescing of views about saying, yeah, that seems to be saying that sort of thing. And that's the sort of thing that happens in qualitative, is that it is subjective, but most of us have subjective views about what somebody has said that reasonably coalesce quite well. And so I think that would be in some way reassuring for you to think that you're just not going to be completely going bonkers when you're doing this assignment. But also just to get a feel for the data that we've got. And I'll also just give a little guide about the final structure for the assignment that you should be aiming for, exactly what to do. Okay. Hey, got to the end in the end. So thank you all very much. I will see you now on Friday for this assessment interview transcription work, which hopefully will be very illuminating. I'll now have to stop my video. Quit. Save as IPA Session.